Welcome to the Dare to Multiply podcast. On this podcast, we help passionate Jesus followers become courageous, obedient disciples who impact their communities for the kingdom of God. I'm your host, Cynthia Anderson, a disciple multiplication coach and trainer. We have some amazing guests coming up, people who are taking risks to launch new discipleship movements in their areas. I can't wait to learn from them and introduce you to their ministries. Together, we'll show you how to make and multiply disciples and groups in your area. If you're new here, be sure to subscribe to the podcast and our YouTube channel so you don't miss out on any tools or content coming your way. I also wanted to mention a free newsletter on disciple making that I send out every single week. It's called Daring Disciples, and it's all about how to share your faith, overcome obstacles we all face in the journey toward multiplication. To subscribe to that, go to daretomultiply.com/newsletter. Let's dare to multiply. What do we mean when we use the term extraordinary prayer? A lot of people talk about that as being really important if you want to launch a disciple-making movement or see this rapid multiplication of disciples in your area. Many trainers refer to this term, extraordinary prayer. Well, today we're going to talk about where it came from, what it is, some examples of extraordinary prayer, and some steps that you can take to grow as a person of extraordinary prayer. So we will be right back with that in just a moment. Are you busy but not seeing the fruit you long for? Dissatisfied with your present level of impact on those around you? Or frustrated with traditional methods of discipleship that don't seem to be effective? If so, the Getting Started in Disciple Making Movements course may be just what you need. Inside the Getting Started program, you'll get access to a step-by-step proven approach to making and multiplying disciples. Not only will you receive 25 short and practical video teachings spread out over 6 modules, but you'll have a chance to connect with others for group coaching via our monthly Zoom calls. And even more importantly, you'll become part of a global community of like-minded people from all over the world who are passionately committed to following Jesus and impacting others around them. If you want to get unstuck and begin moving forward as a disciple who makes disciples, I encourage you to go to courses.dmmsfrontiermissions.com and sign up for this powerful program today. And now to today's episode. Okay, so today we are talking about what is extraordinary prayer. And I wanted to start with a little bit of a kind of historical review of where this term originated, kind of where it came from. And we could go back all the way to Jonathan Edwards. He definitely wrote about the importance of extraordinary prayer in the releasing of revivals. But I especially wanted to talk about in church planting movements and disciple-making movements, movemental thinking of our modern kind of era. Where did this term come from and kind of how did it become popularized or something that many, many trainers who talk about and teach on disciple multiplication reference? So it first came up and began to be referenced. Most people credit it to David Garrison and his book, which came out back in 1999. It was a booklet called Church Planting Movements. And prayer was listed as one of the universal elements that he talked about in that booklet. And that booklet is available for free online. It's kind of one of the classic basal, you might say, booklets that many, many hundreds of thousands of people around the world read. And that's how a lot of things began to move forward regarding, pursuing of church planting movements. So anyhow, Garrison said in his book on page 33, and I want to read this quote, prayer has been fundamental to every church planting movement we have observed. Prayer typically provides the first pillar in a strategy coordinator's master plan for reaching his or her people group. However, it is the vitality of prayer in the missionary's life, their personal life, that leads to its imitation in the life of the new church and its leaders. By revealing from the beginning the source of his or her power in prayer, the missionary effectively gives away the greatest resource he brings to the assignment. This sharing of the power source is critical to the transfer of vision and momentum from the missionary to the new local Christian leadership. So we see that way back then, 1999, when Garrison was studying these new movements that were emerging, and when there were only a handful of them that had taken place in the modern era instead of the several thousand that we see today, prayer was identified even back then as one of the fundamental parts of the master plan that has to be part of what we do as we pursue the catalyzing or the launching of movements. It was also referenced in Chris Galanos's book, From Megachurch to Multiplication. He actually is the one who used the word extraordinary prayer, and he referenced it as a crucial element if we want to move from a megachurch idea to a multiplication of disciples. And he's also one who defined it. He defines it this way. He says, it's going beyond ordinary prayer practices by continually adding new elements to one's prayer life to make it more fervent and impactful. Another great leader, David Watson, who wrote Contagious Disciple Making and has been influential in so many people's lives who have begun to pursue disciple multiplication. Again, one of those great writers and trainers like David Garrison, and an early pioneer who pursued disciple making movements, starting in India, but then globally. And he emphasized that leaders in DMMs spend significant amounts of time in prayer, sometimes up to 6 hours a day, combining both personal and team prayer. And he believes that prayer should be a lifestyle. So that's something David Watson talked about, how prayer needs to be a lifestyle integrated into all the different aspects of our prayer life. And he also talked about building extensive prayer networks to support the movement. I think he was the first one who really emphasized that we should not only have a church planning movement, but we need a parallel prayer movement that's happening both inside and outside of the movement. Another person I could refer to is Alan Hirsch, who talked about how a deep and committed and consistent prayer life that goes beyond sort of routine practices is essential for catalyzing and sustaining movements that are deeply rooted in the mission of Jesus. And so many leaders have talked about this, written about it, and even your very own, yep, Cynthia Anderson. I wrote about it as well in my book, The Multipliers Mindset. And in fact, it was one of the 17 shifts that I talk about, moving from prayer as a prelude to prayer as power, and how it's so, so important if we want to see movements catalyzed. So, many people have written and talked about that, but it gives you a little bit of a history of where this term came from and why so many of us who write and speak and teach and train about movements and disciple multiplication have seen over and over that it is critical in catalyzing and launching new movements that really take off and begin to spread. But it's good to define what we really mean. Now, I read Chris Galanos's definition already, but let's talk about that a little bit. What is extraordinary prayer exactly? Well, to state the obvious, it is extraordinary, right? It's beyond normal prayer routines or normal prayer. It's beyond praying before your food and praying in the church service and praying, before you go out for ministry. It's beyond those normal routines of prayer. And it's kind of those things are expected of any normal Christian. It's beyond normal Christian prayer and even beyond the normal prayer life of most Christian leaders. We're talking about something that is beyond the normal, beyond the ordinary. It involves the prioritization, of prayer over meetings, over administrative work, and even over other kinds of events. This has been something God has been really convicting me and the organization that I lead, Disciple Makers Increase, in this last year, is that we really want to be people who pray more than we meet, who prioritize prayer in everything we do. That prayer is the first thing we do when there's a problem to be solved, not searching for solutions on the internet or troubleshooting it ourselves. Prayer is our go-to. Prayer is something we put in our rhythms, we put it in our regular practices, but it's really a mentality of prioritization of prayer over action and activities, and even disciple making activities that we do, like going out to share the gospel or looking for the person of peace, or um, you know training leaders or running trainings all over the place that we do, and we find those things sometimes easier to do than pressing in prayer. But prayer has to be at the core of all we do. It has to be one of our top priorities when we begin in a new area, but also throughout. We must prioritize prayer. The extraordinary prayer also has to do with your personal prayer life, the prayer life of a leader. A leader who doesn't pray, not only having your quiet time, and that's all kind of expected normal prayer, but who doesn't set aside extensive time to pray for the people that they are training, to pray for the people they are coaching and discipling, to pray for the communities that they are working to reach, to pray personally for the lost and for the multiplication of disciples. A leader who doesn't do that is unlikely to see the release of a movement. It has to start with us as leaders. It starts with our own personal prayer life, but it also has to do with corporate prayer, praying online, praying in person, praying in small groups, praying in large groups, but calling other people together to join you in corporate prayer is a part of catalyzing or moving forward in extraordinary prayer efforts. It's an intentional increasing of prayer activities, right? So it's not only quality prayer, but it's also increasing the quantity of prayer that you and your team and the believers in the movement are doing. It's intentionally looking for ways to do that through prayer, walking through. Sometimes a lot of movements I've heard do chain prayer, where they're having months of prayer, and different people are praying on different days or different hours. We're in the midst of a chain prayer effort as Disciple Makers Increase in our DMM community right now. We're just about to finish 50 days of prayer. In fact, when this is released, it might already be over. But taking time to have these prayer events where you call people corporately to these prayer activities and to chain prayer. Some people do all night prayer meetings. There's lots of different ways to increase your activity of prayer, and it's not just prayer of going through the motions, but special activities kind of mobilize people in a different kind of way. So that's something that is part of extraordinary prayer. And it also often includes fasting. In fact, I would say that the majority of people, I can't think of one person who I've seen release a movement or see fruitfulness to the degree where they're seeing fourth, fifth, sixth generation rapid multiplication, who doesn't make fasting a regular part of both their personal life, and they also call for corporate fasting. We know Jesus said, that there's certain kinds of things that only come out by prayer and fasting, only some kinds of demonic strongholds that are only broken in that way. And so fasting also needs to be a part of our prayer lives if we're going to move into a extraordinary prayer kind of level as we pursue movements and as we pursue disciple multiplication in our areas. Well, I wanted to share with you as well some examples of extraordinary prayer. I have been so privileged to know many people As I've been working with movement leaders and pursuing movements for over 30 years, I've known some really extraordinary movement leaders, and I've been able to see their lives close up as they've modeled for me and challenged my own prayer life. There was a pastor in South India. His name was Daniel, and Daniel would wake early in the morning. We would be having meetings for our organization, and he would wake up early in the morning. And I wake up early. I'm a 5 a.m. or before kind of riser, but I would wake up early, go out into the hallway, and I would hear this voice down the hall. And he was down the hallway. He'd found himself a little spot, and he was seeking the face of God, often had his head covered and was interceding, praying in the Spirit of God. He was seeking God's face. He would always pray. I've never, every time I was with him when I visited his house as well, same thing. Early in the morning, before he did anything else, before he even had his breakfast, he would be up for 2 or 3 hours seeking God and interceding and seeking the face of the Lord. It challenged me deeply and was a model for me. One of the Nigerian friends that I've been mentoring and coaching in disciple making, she has challenged me so much. She is a woman of prayer, and she leads her people in 2 hours of daily prayer online. They also have long seasons of chain prayer and fasting. Often she won't, they'll do this chain fasting where someone will be praying from morning till 3 o'clock and fasting, and then someone else picks it up from 3 o'clock into the evening. And they'll have these seasons, long seasons, sometimes even a full year of chain prayer and chain fasting, crying out to God for her people and for the unreached in her city, in her country. Amazing woman of prayer. I've learned so much from her. Another example, and I was privileged to be with Ying and Grace Kai, who wrote together with the late Steve Smith, the T for T, Training for Trainers book, which was another classic book that God has used to help people who are starting church planting movements around the world. And Ying and Grace are people of prayer. They came to visit and train some of our friends and colleagues and the people we were working with in India one time. It was their first visit to India. And we were just so happy to be able to show them the beautiful land of India. And we were in a particular city, and we had a day before the training would actually start. And so I asked Ying and Grace, hey, would you like to go out? We can take you sightseeing and show you a little bit of India so that you don't just see only what's in the classroom. And they said, no, thank you. We'll take the time to pray. They were so committed to prayer. Prayer was so much more important to them than tourism. And then seeing the sights of India, right? They wanted to pray for the people of India. They wanted to pray for the people who would be coming to the training. That was what mattered to them. They spent hours in prayer, and that's why they saw such incredible multiplication. So many hundreds of thousands of disciples making disciples through their ministry. Amazing people of prayer. There's another story that I often tell. I tell it on my webinar, and I tell it many times when I'm doing on-site trainings. It's the story of a young couple. And they were also working in South India, and they heard about church planting movements, and they were interested to see that happen. The Great Commission had gripped their hearts, and they went to their city, and they actually spent the first 3 months, every morning from 5 to 7 a.m. in the morning, they would walk every street of the city. They would carry their little baby on their shoulder, and they would walk and they would pray, walk and pray, walk and pray, crying out to God to move in their city. And after 3 or 4 months, they began to find persons of peace, and miracles began to be released. They knew that in order to see their city reached, they had to start with a foundation of prayer, extraordinary prayer. I want to mention too the focus of extraordinary prayer, because there are many who pray a lot, right? And people pray many times for many things. Many times people will send me prayer requests and they want me to pray for their child's exams, or they want me to pray for their finances, or they want me to pray for them to get a new job. And I'm happy to do that if it's people I know. But really, the focus of extraordinary prayer is on the lost. It's praying for the unreached. It's praying for the community that is around you, and it's praying for the world. It is outward focused, not inward focused, right? And so when we call people to prayer, we are calling them to pray for others. We're calling them really to the high priestly role of intercession, right? Entering into the presence of God and interceding before him for him to release the unreached, those who don't know Jesus, and to change their hearts and break their hearts and open their hearts to the truth of his word. It's tearing down strongholds, right, that are there, that have maybe been there for centuries, or maybe they're strongholds that have recently taken root in your community or in your society. So it's outward focused. It's not focused on us and what we need, as some, old time prayer meetings used to be. It's focused on God, and it's focused on those that he wants to reach. But it also involves personal listening. It involves drawing near to God in intimacy with him as leaders, right? We have to take time to seek his face, to seek intimacy with God, to just be silent before him and let him speak to us, to hear his guidance, to hear his assurance. So as we enter into a lifestyle of prayer, into a life of prayer, we need to not only intercede, which is so important, but we also need to seek him personally, just to seek to know him, just to seek to hear what is on his heart, his whispers into our spirit. So it involves that for us personally. So I hope this gives you a little bit of an idea of what extraordinary prayer is all about. Well, I'm going to be back in just a moment with some ideas that you can begin with, and give you some tips as we move forward. So I'll be right back with that in just a moment.
Imagine a world where passionate followers of Jesus come together to multiply, transforming lives beyond imagination. Instead of toiling with little fruit, what if God's abundance flowed beyond your wildest dreams? Picture those you've invested in sharing Jesus freely, creating a ripple effect of disciple-making. In her new book, The Multiplier's Mindset, Cynthia Anderson reveals how shifting mindsets can revolutionize disciple-making. When Cynthia and her colleagues experienced these mindset shifts, they saw enormous results, including the launching of 19 multiplying movements in Africa and Asia, transforming tens of thousands of lives. This book will help you discover hidden harvesters, see church members move from passivity to passion, and release the power of simplicity in multiplying disciples. Don't remain stuck. Learn to move toward greater fruitfulness. Visit multipliersmindset.com and get your copy of The Multiplier's Mindset today.
Okay, quick wrap up. Key points. This is a term that people have used for quite a while, since 1999 when David Garrison coined it. And it's been something that all of us who train and teach on church planting movements, disciple making movements, movement dynamics, emphasize the importance of extraordinary prayer. It's going beyond the normal routines of a Christian prayer life to something that is both quality and quantity increasing, depth in God increasing. So here's some ideas you can get started with. I want to say, don't be overwhelmed by some of the examples I've given. Some of them are really pretty incredible, and they may feel very intimidating for you to begin there. But start small, but also aim at extraordinary, right? Whatever's extraordinary for you. And what may be extraordinary for you may be quite different from what's extraordinary for someone else. That is okay. But aim at extraordinary. Don't aim at just normal, right? So we start with baby steps, we start with micro steps, but we aim at the extraordinary. And start with yourself, but also pull in others. I know in my prayer life, I stay motivated when I pray with other people, not only praying alone. So do this as a team or with your church or with others in your community who are also believing for disciple multiplication. And I also want to say that consistency is more important than it feeling amazing, right? Just be consistent, be faithful. That is extraordinary. When you are faithful and committed in your prayer life, that is extraordinary. So here's some ideas you can begin with. One is commit to praying daily for a week, right? Just pray daily for a week for the lost people in your community. Another thing is you could commit to do a prayer walk this week with at least one other friend. Just start with one prayer walk, and then maybe you're going to make that a regular thing. Okay. Fast one meal and pray for the lost and broken in your community or for those that you're discipling, maybe for both, right? But fast one meal. Start with one meal. You don't have to start with a 40-day fast, right? Start with one meal and then maybe work into making that a regular part of your routine, that you do that every week on a certain day of the week. Plan a prayer event for your team or church that focuses on God's heart for the lost, and it's focused on the community. And invite some people into a prayer event and make it something that's doable. I wouldn't recommend you start real big if there are people who aren't used to praying. But maybe even in your church service, maybe take 10 minutes out of your sermon time to just lead people in praying for the lost and praying for the community, where you're starting to build that prayer muscle. That would be extraordinary, right? Instead of a sermon, to increase the prayer time that happens in the service. So these are just some suggestions, but I really want to encourage you, do something, right? Do something to increase your extraordinary prayer life, to make it more extraordinary, something beyond the norm, beyond what you always do as a Christian in prayer. If you're somebody who's been on this disciple making journey for a long time, up your game, right? Maybe you've been, doing something that was extraordinary for you 5 years ago, but it's not extraordinary anymore. What would be extraordinary today? Continue to increase what you do in prayer. God's going to anoint you. God's going to help you to grow in this area, but start with one small step this week. God bless you guys. We'll see you in the next podcast. That's all we've got for this episode of Dare to Multiply. One thing that would really help both us and other people who might like to listen in is for you to rate and review the podcast, if you haven't done that yet, on iTunes, Spotify, or wherever you listen. I'd also love to connect with you on Instagram, LinkedIn, or Twitter. Feel free to message me with any topics, questions you'd like addressed, or guests you'd like me to interview. Until next week, then, please remember, no matter how ordinary you feel, God's dreams for us are always bigger than we can imagine. Let's dare to trust Him for a greater harvest.